Schilit, the speaker for the HCII seminar today. Bill is currently a researcher at Google Research. And previously before that, he was co-director of the Internal Research Lab in Seattle. And for that, he was managing digital libraries and mobile computing at OCR'ed and Mellon. And he was also working in this one I'm most jealous of the original ubiquitous computing project at Carnegie. So he's actually done a lot of cool stuff, and today he's going to be talking about what we're doing at Google Research dealing with digital libraries and Google books. But before he starts, I also want to say we have a nice HCII shirt for him. So that you can do free advertising for us as you go back to Google. Okay, so I'll put this on your hand.
So that's irrespective of my performance here?
Yes.
Okay, so how to read 15 million books in one sitting. And I want to give you sort of a Christmas story of e-reading past, present, and future. And let's start with the past. In the late 90s, when I was at FXPAL, we developed something that we call the active reading machine. At the time, BMW had all these commercials about the ultimate driving machine, and they were cute. And so this device, a tablet computer you hold in your lap, it shows you a page at a time. You annotate it with a pen and you highlighted words. The computer would go off and do searches on those words that you highlighted and come back with results, but also let you organize your ink. And we developed this system, we call it a paper user interface, a PUI. We briefly thought it was a paper tablet user interface, a PUI, but that didn't go over so well. So I just want to give you a little bit of context of some work in this area. You can go and look at this at CHI and Digital Libraries and Hypertext and Computer Magazine. But enough with the past, it's not well there. I want to bring you to the present and think about ebooks and e-reading and what is happening. So I want you to notice that it's magical, incredible, and unbelievably great. It really is. I saw the keynote. So Steve and Jeff, for sure, have been talking about reading books on these devices. But back to sort of my story, when I got to Google, I didn't take a device look at ebooks and e-reading. I sort of deviated from there, and instead I looked at the content side. You know, what can we learn about the content that's available for ebooks? And when I got to Google, I saw this wonderful site called books.google.com. Go there now. And it has over 15 million scanned and OCR'ed books. So OCR is optical character recognition. You take a photograph of the page, and then you turn it into digital form so it can be searched. We have 29 partner libraries in the US, Europe, and Asia, and a number of libraries like the New York Public Library. We also have 20,000 publisher partners who upload their books into this. And the books are in dozens of languages, so that's one thing that's interesting about this. And so one thing about books is they've been popular for a while, and there's a lot of them out there. It's actually hard to figure out how many books are out there because it depends how you count. There's a lot of things that aren't quite books, that are pamphlets. Do you count those? There are a lot of things that are multi-volumes. How do you count those? There's books that exist in editions. Should you count those as one or more? But, you know, the rough estimate that people use is about 30 to 150 million books that have been made available since the dawn of printing, the mass production of books. And one thing that's interesting here is, you know, this is the total, the vast sum of human knowledge in book form. Library of Congress has 32 million books. The British Library, 25 million in their collection. Google Book Search is, you know, approaching with 10 million a very significant portion of, you know, this whole. So what's different, you know, with books and web? When we talk about e-reading, how is e-reading books different than e-reading on the web? And the big difference is that here's how web pages evolved, sort of in this dynamic way of the web existed, somebody added a page, they added a link, they added another link, they added another page. It was all this evolution of links and pages together, the hypertext. And with books, we just have the text. We don't have the hype. So my project here was really to bring out the hype in books. So, again, what's going on here is that the text in books doesn't have links, although we have, over time, added some techniques to create links. Combining the back of the book bibliography, adding links to that, even taking things like the table of contents and adding links from the table of contents into the book. But given that this whole text corpus is very flat and doesn't have links, it means that when you read it, you don't have that web experience of jumping to something else that's interesting or related. You don't have hubs and authorities, and you don't have page rank. That's a big thing. You don't know whether this part of this book is more important than some other part of some other book. The second big thing that's different between the text books and the web is that the documents are really big. Books are long, web pages are short, relatively. You do a search and we land you on a book, and we give you a book, it's a little bit difficult to say, go read the entire book, the answer's in here somewhere. It might be reasonable to scan a web page. So our idea, to sort of make reading ebooks a little bit more like reading the web was to try and make the books into a rich hypertext by looking over all the books and finding and linking the quotations that exist in the book. So why quotations? So the big one for me is that if you're reading a book and you see a quotation, you can then jump to the primary source and read the quotation in the primary source, the author's original words. Or if you're reading a quotation and you don't quite understand it, you can jump to another book that talks about the same quotation, the secondary source, and read their interpretation. So this is really a very rich way of navigating the space of books. It really explains what I call the truth and meaning of passages. And the other thing that's interesting about quotations is if you look at all that text that's in books, you got to think that some of the text is more important than other bits of the text. And what we're trying to do here is look at this ocean of text and ask, what are the nuggets that are interesting, that are wise, that are more valuable? And our statement here is it's like a wisdom of the crowds effect. If an author copied one piece of book to another book, it must have been important for that author. If 2 authors did it, it must have been more important. If 100 authors did it, it's pretty important. So what are quotes and why are they interesting? Here's an example. Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. It is a weapon unique in history which cuts without wounding. Quote by Martin Luther King. If you look at this in our corpus, it appears in lots and lots and lots of books. And what's interesting, it's like a thread that connects all these books. And it connects books that are talking specifically about Martin Luther King. It connects books that may be talking about the Nobel Prize. You want a Nobel Prize. Talking about nonviolence. And there's this connection between Martin Luther King and Gandhi that you sort of see through this quotation. So it's like a thread. It's like a hypertext, right? So at this point, you should say, oh, we've seen this all before. Phil is just quoting Ted Nelson. So there's a fellow, a famous person in the history of hypertext, Ted Nelson, who was a real visionary. He actually coined the term hypertext. And he had this idea that really never came to fruition, which was transclusion. And the idea with transclusion is that you would create links between documents for pieces of the documents. Currently, we have in the web a link between documents that's really just a pointer to the other document or maybe just a pointer to the section. Here, the idea is that you would have passages that link to other similar passages. And his proposal for how to do this in his book Literary Machines from 1982 was that as authors typed their hypertext, they would go and grab some piece of the existing hypertext and link it in. And so it was a very manual process. He called these edit decision lists, and he expected authors to do it. So our big difference here is that we took Ted's idea and we figured out how to automate it, without having all those authors. Most of them are dead now, they're over 100 years old. We didn't want them to go back and retype in their books, so we did it automatically. And when we started looking at quotations, one thing that really popped out as surprising was just the enormity of the use of quotations in the books. You wouldn't really think it, I guess, but quotes are all over the place. I have some slides later on where you can talk about what we call coverage. And one thing about quotations, when you start thinking about it, is it is a fundamental human trait to quote. There's creativity, and then there's quotation. I would say that those are both at a similar level in being human. And we see quotations in architecture. We see quotations in music. Brahms was famous for going to the countryside, listening to some folk music, and then taking it and orchestrating it and selling it. And of course, we see quoting all the time in art. Jeff Koons is very famous for taking the everyday object and making it metal and coloring it and selling it for $10 million. So we see quotes in all these different fields, and of course, we've seen quotes in text and in writing and in literature, and that's really what we're after. So I mentioned that quoting is very pervasive. So I've just come up with some examples, and I should mention that these were early examples in our research, so the counts don't quite match, because this was actually from early work where we hadn't processed all the books, but you see Vannevar Bush's quote about trailblazing, in 33 books. You see Leo Szilard's quote about how he discovered, nuclear fusion, in 43 books. You see Thomas Jefferson in 557 books. Jackson Pollock, 145 books. This quote that you never heard of, we probably never even heard of the author, in 145 books. So quotes are all over the place. And sometimes they're not even identified as quotes. So that's something that's interesting. So what we want to do is take all of these quotes in all the books, millions and millions and millions and millions of books, and mine them. And we sort of sat down and said, how can we do this? And we came up with some ways not to do it. We actually tried some of these initially. The first one was, we have already a book of quotations in our corpus. Why don't we just take Bartlett's book of quotations and search all the other books for everything that's in that book? And the problem with this idea is that Bartlett's quotations is only going to include quotes that happened up to the time of that book being published. It's not going to include new books that come. So basically, you'll cut off all the new quotes. It won't be a living, growing corpus of quotes. So we didn't really like that. And also, if you look at any of these books of quotations, they're really biased by the editors who put them together. In some obvious ways, but also in some subtle ways. I think the big bias that these books have is that these quotes generally are things that you would tend to say at a cocktail party to look intelligent. And those aren't necessarily the kind of quotes that we want, unless you're really into cocktail parties. So then we said, okay, we're not going to use Bartlett's and search for those. Maybe we could just look for quote marks. And so, there's all these pages that have quote marks. And the problem is that I actually tried this. I didn't actually figure this out before I wrote the code to do it. But fiction has dialogue, and dialogue has bookmarks. So yeah, you get a lot of quotes, but you also get a lot of dialogue that isn't quotes. And you also tend to miss all of these things that are quotes that don't have quote marks because they use other means of sort of talking about the quote. They indent, they italicize, and of course the primary sources, don't have quote marks. Or the authors originally wrote those words; they didn't know they were going to be quoted. And moreover, when you look at quote marks, you got to ask the question, how is this going to work in Farsi or some other language that we really don't know too much about, but we just know that we don't want to spend the rest of our lives tuning this algorithm to work in hundreds and hundreds of languages as we start getting those books. So, yeah, I don't see any bookmarks here. So we sat down, we tried some things that didn't work, and then we thought, well, what would work? What would be an inclusive way of finding quotations in this corpus of books? And it's huge, right? So it has to be sort of scalable. And we came down to the very basic definition of a quote, is that it always repeats, given a large enough corpus. It's sort of what makes a quote is somebody has copied it. They've quoted it. So if you find things that repeat, there are quotes in there. It's sort of all-inclusive, and then the problem is that things repeat that aren't quotes. And again, we ran the algorithm, and the first thing we came up with is 1,000 quotes that look like this. Reserved, books are overdue if not returned or renewed by the hour. This is in the front plate of a large number of books that we scanned from a university partner library, the Humanities Library of Berkeley. And it's not a very good quote. I mean, I guess it sort of fits the definition of a quote. It's in all these books, but it's not really very good. We also found some other things that repeat that aren't quotes. This kind of boilerplate copyright published by Penguin Group. Sort of citations tend to repeat. And then there's this kind of stuff where the author wrote a dozen books, and in every one of her books, she thanked her agent, Ruby Brown, for all their support. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my editor, Karen Thomas. Every book she wrote, she said that. And we also found all of these tables of prime numbers, tables of logarithms. It turns out before we had calculators and before we had computers, it was useful and necessary to buy a book that had tables of all of these numerical constants and look stuff up. And we have a lot of those in our corpus. So looking for things that repeat certainly gets all the quotes, but it also gets things that aren't quotes. So we have this process that we're liberal and we mine everything. We find all the repeats above a certain size. And then we have this stage where we try and group those things that are repeating. So things that are similar come together. I'll explain why. And then we do this filtering stage where we try and get rid of stuff that isn't a quote by many metrics. And we know that we're never going to be 100% correct with filtering. Like, you don't want to be too aggressive in your filtering and start removing quotes. So we also have this ranking where we put things that were sure are quotes high in the ranking and things that were less sure low in the ranking. And then we have this user interface where we let users navigate within and across books by these quotes. So you're reading the primary source, you can jump to secondary sources, and secondary sources, primary source, and all that. And the end result here is the largest known quotation collection. So by orders and orders of magnitude, more than those books that you can buy and any other online thing. So I have just one slide on mining, and I should mention that there's a paper that describes this entire process in excruciating detail. If you're interested in information retrieval and computational linguistics and things like that, you should go read the papers. But essentially what we do is we take all the books one at a time and we split them into little pieces called shingles. And they're called shingles because it's a sequence of words, like 8 words, and we overlap them like shingles on a roof. And these are basically what we toss into the soup, stir it around, and then try and find pieces that match. So it's a little bit like in computational biology, where you go and you look for DNA repeats or motifs. There's a similar kind of algorithm there. Although I should mention that human DNA is much, much smaller than all the printed books. So some of the algorithms that they use there don't actually translate here. But it's a basic idea. You cut all your content into little pieces, stir it around, and you try and find pieces that match. You grow them and find larger pieces. I should mention that you get really big numbers when you start doing this. And lucky for us, Google has lots of disk drives and lots of computers. The next stage after you sort of find these repeats of maximal length is you ask the question, well, what about things that are similar but not exactly the same? And we call that grouping. And here's the example. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. This is a quote by Nehru. And whoops. And what's interesting here is here's like an original source, primary source, and here's just the first sentence of it with an introduction that says Nehru declared. And here it's sort of used in this way where long years ago said Nehru, and it's written. And here's an example where our OCR engine had a problem with some E's and some other E's and maybe a D. And we got a lot of OCR errors, and so it didn't match because of OCR errors. So these are the kinds of things we have to deal with, and ideally we'd like all these things to fit together. So we have a technique for stitching all these different pieces together. The filtering and ranking stage is we have billions and billions and billions of what we call candidate quotations, including that this book is on reserve from the library. And what we'd like to do is filter out some of them that are obviously wrong, or obviously, let's say, not quotations, and then rank the rest. So let's say we have some sequence of text, and it occurs in 1,000 books. We can ask, for each of those 1,000 books, what page does that occur on? If that sequence of text always occurs on page 1 of all of those 1,000 books, it's highly suspect that that is a quote. And we actually have a theory of, borrowed from information entropy that says a quote is good if it is uniformly distributed along a number of dimensions. And those dimensions are things like, it shouldn't only be in the front of the book. It shouldn't only be in the back of the book. It should be sort of distributed through the pages. It shouldn't only be in books by one author. It should be distributed across many authors. It shouldn't only be in books by one publisher. Get those boilerplates. It should be across many publishers. It shouldn't only be in books from one library source, not just from that Berkeley Humanity Library. And so using this kind of information entropy model, we can say whether something is reasonably a quote or whether something isn't. We also look for language features where too many numbers and other kinds of repetitions mean that it's not a quote. And we do this ranking where we can also use the information entropy model for it to help the ranking. Things that one author repeats over and over again it's not a very good quote, even though some other authors might repeat it. But we basically demote things that are very short, because those tend to be like colloquial phrases. And we also demote things that are very long. those tend to be like letters in a collection, like Lincoln's letters. You see those over and over again in many books. Martin Luther King's speeches, you see those over and over again in many books. And we also demote things that are very frequent. And that's a little bit, it just works. Turns out that things that are too frequent tend also not to be quotes. So when we're done with this filtering and ranking, we have tens of millions of ranked quotations. And basically, this is possible because we can run this on 2,000 or 4,000 machines for a couple of days. We take tens of millions of books as input. We send a book to each of the processors they run. This process is called MapReduce, if you're familiar with that. And in the end, you get the answer after, I think, maybe 8 or 10 processing phases. So getting back to our goal here, which is to provide users who are reading ebooks more of a web-like experience. What's that like? So what I'm going to show you here is the version that we launched a while back, I guess a year ago. And it's changed some, but the stuff is still there if you dig around. But this, in my mind, was the ideal. While reading a book, this is the book 6 Degrees of Separation by John Gare. It's a play. He's a playwright. And what's interesting about this book is he talked about this notion that each person in the world is connected to every other person by the 6 degrees of separation. And what we had here was, on the right-hand side, we had a way of opening up a summary and also showing, we didn't call it quotations, we called it popular passages. Basically, for this book, we would show you some popular passages that you could click on and find the text in the book. It says, the quote is, "I read somewhere that everybody on this planet is separated by only 6 other people. It exists on page 45. It appears in 13 books from the years 2000 to 2006. And you click on that. You could jump to page 45 and see it. The character Lisa says this in Act 3, Scene 2. Maybe. And if you click on this appears in, you get this kind of display. Normally, on the web, when you click on a link, you go to one other page. In this case, we basically have an n-way link. There's many different books, many different pages that we want to link to. What this is showing you is, I read somewhere that everybody on this planet is separated by only 6 other people. It's showing you where you came from, and it's showing you all the books that have it. And you can basically click on each of these and go there. So what's interesting here is we started with a play, and now we're in this sort of social theory, a book on social theory. And here's a book on Stanley Milgram, who's a social psychologist at Stanton, at Yale in the 1950s and 60s, who did a lot of these studies. So basically, you start seeing all these different threads from different disciplines brought together by this quote. You also see a lot of books that are, the ultimate scene and monologue source book, because it's a good play. It's been quoted in those books. So here we can then jump to this book on LinkedIn or linking and see this quote in context and read about it and what does this person have to say about it. And from there you can see some other quotes that appear in this book and forever follow the path without reading any more books. But this is one of the other views we give you. There's sort of a large view about this book. If you go now to this website, you'll see that popular passages now exist about this book page. And it's just sort of another view on So that, pretty much covered what we were thinking of how to bring ebooks up to the level of the web. And I want to talk a little bit about the future. And this was a follow-on activity that we did after we did quotations. So when we were showing this to people, they said, it's nice to be able to read a book and see the quotations in the book and to link to another book that has quotations and then so on and so forth. But aren't these quotations like first-class citizens? Can't we treat these quotations as things unto themselves that stand alone and I can look at them all and be able to navigate them? And so that's, what we're trying to do here is the notion that maybe key ideas or great ideas or big ideas that people have had across the last 500 years are reflected in the quotations that exist in books. And one reason we got here is because we saw a lot of big ideas in the books that we were mining. One of them was this notion of eco-politics. I didn't even know before I started this work that there's even a field called eco-politics. And there is, and this Brunkman report actually defines what the field is about. And it's a very popular quote in this small discipline. It's a great idea in the field of eco-politics. So really, what we're trying to do here was say, looking at a library, a digital library, where are the ideas? Where are the big ideas in this library? Should I go to the last row, top shelf? Are those all the ideas? Where's the big idea on ecology? Where's the big idea on democracy? Environmentalism. What are the big ideas? If I want to learn about environmentalism, what are those big ideas that Al Gore came up with? I think the internet was one. Something else. There must be a second. So that's sort of the vision is, just looking at this large collection of books, show me the ideas. I come up with an idea, let me find it. And the problem, of course, is that, if you read a book like Beyond Good and Evil, you open it up, this Friedrich Nietzsche, I had to read this for school. I must admit, I did not get through it because it's really hard to tell, where are the ideas in this book? Every once in a while, you feel like there's something here, but you're not sure. And the thing about quotations is, here's a part that was quoted by 123 people. Here's another part that was quoted by 740. Here's a really hot part. So it's almost like a heat map of this book. And what's great about this is, hey, I no longer have to read all of Beyond Good and Evil. I can just read the red stuff. and I'll probably get some idea. So that was what we're trying to do is take the corpus, extract the great ideas, and let people find those great ideas, go back to the books and read them, things like that. Turns out that we weren't the first researchers to think about extracting great ideas from the corpus of human knowledge. It turns out that in the 50s and 60s, there was a group at the University of Chicago and Encyclopedia Britannica that published something called the Great Books. And the Great Books were sold door to door along with Encyclopedia Britannica. And here they are. And it was mostly this fellow Mortimer Adler, who was a faculty member at University of Chicago, who sort of promoted this. And there's actually an entire educational theory about teaching with the great books and reading the great books. And the great books, one thing is they're capital G great, so it's like whatever they said was great was there. It's not necessarily great. It was these 443 works in 54 volumes, and they decided, what was in the great books. And it turned out that it was like a lot of these classical authors, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, Adam Smith, Swift, a lot of dead Greeks were in this collection. And one thing that Mortimer Adler did, along with a slew of graduate students, all the graduate students, you should be happy you don't have to do this type of work anymore. What he did was he had these students read all of these books and pick out when they were talking about certain ideas. And then he cataloged all those ideas, and he decided that there are 102 great ideas, and everything else is a minor idea. And so he has these ideas: eternity, education, duty, dialectic, desire, democracy, from A to Z of ideas. He has these, this is a picture of him and his grad students with the great books that they've read, well thumbed. This took many, many years to do. What did I have? There are 7 years, 50 indexers, 75 clerical staff, $1 million in the 50s. And they came up with this 2-volume index for the great books. And the way it worked is that you would pick a great idea, you'd say, I wonder what this democracy thing is all about. You'd open your index, the great ideas, it would have a little essay on democracy, and it would say, also look at, and it would point at Plato, and it would point at all of these dead Greeks, and it would point at Jefferson and some other more modern people who wrote about that topic. And of course, one thing about the great ideas, and actually the entire great books movement in education, was it was extremely controversial. And if we were only living in those times, it would have been great, right? But so the big controversy was that there's this group of guys, white males, sitting at the University of Chicago who were deciding what was the sum of human knowledge. And that really irritated a lot of people, even in the 60s, believe it or not. The quote here is, in times like ours, it is plainly impossible for 10 or 12 men working in one single tradition to select and explain all the greatest books and all the greatest ideas. And, they were missing some ideas. And Mortimer Adler was really adamant in keeping the ideas at 102. Like, God forbid, in the second edition, they couldn't add another great idea. So, it was pointed out, hey, you're missing equality. Human equality as a great idea. He didn't really care, missing civil rights. It was okay to be missing some of these. And of course, it wasn't our great ideas. There are really no women or minorities in any of these books that they selected as the great books until Mortimer Adler left that post as editor of Encyclopedia Britannica and the great books. So our approach was, here's another place where maybe computers can help. We don't have 10 or 12, white males sitting at the University of Chicago doing this work. Instead, we have 4,000 machines in a Google data center doing this, and we automate it. Then maybe we could be a little bit more balanced in finding great ideas. And so really that's what we tried to do is say, these quotations that we've been mining, a lot of them are copies of great ideas. They're the copies of Jefferson talking about democracy. The reason they're copied is because they're concise descriptions of those ideas. And second, it's not just the quotes, but it's the labels we give those quotes. And I'll talk about that. So really what we're trying to do is use the quotations for the great ideas and then the terms that introduce the quotations. You might have a quotation that occurs in 1,000 books. So that means we have 1,000 authors introduce this. We can look at those words. So here's the example of finding the introductory words near a quote. This was a quote from Justice Stevens' opinion in Bush v. Gore. At the time we did this, there were 81 instances. I'm sure there are many, many more now because it's a very famous quote. And this was the quote. When there was some controversy over the voting that went on and the hanging chads and all of this, And the quote is, the longest quotation text that we sort of identified in these 81 instances is, although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the law. This case went to the Supreme Court, and they didn't make the right decision. So I think in hindsight, you realize that now. And what's interesting about this is we have the quote, and we could look at all the words that introduce in these 81 instances, and we see things pop out. Justice John Paul Stevens, his name is not in the quote, but his name is in a number of the introductions to the quote. So we now have a label. Florida's sunshine laws, we have a label. Mr. Gore, manual recounts. We see these kinds of words repeat over and over and over again. And then we can say, oh, this is a quote about manual recounts. It's a quote maybe by John Paul Stevens. Maybe it's by Mr. Gore, we don't really know, but that's okay. So what we're trying to do here is somebody wants to know more about democracy, equality, or in our case, we typed in space race, something that was a little bit out there. Think about the tail. This might be more in the long tail. Without editors sitting together, deciding what's in or what's out. Basically on computational level, counting up how popular these quotes are, counting up the frequency of introductory words, we're able to find some interesting stuff. So this is the experimental user interface. This wasn't launched. This was more for internal investigation. If you type in the word space race, you basically get a lot of quotes where space race introduced that quote. And this one, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, appeared in 323 books. And what's interesting about what we did here was we also gave you related labels. So then you could click on those and find other related quotes. And we actually came up with a number of pretty good quotes for anything that you typed in, ranked by the number of times that quote appeared in books, moderated by this information diffusion or information entropy model, and using the labels to actually identify what this is about. And there's a couple of bugs here. So this is one, I don't know if you could see it, but it says it appears in these books from 1868 to 2007. And this is that Buzz Aldrin quote. And, if we were to launch this, it would really set those conspiracy theorists going. So this is like some of these issues, I'll go through maybe one or two of them, are reasons why we have a difficulty just launching stuff like this because the quality is not so good. Turns out that there's a lot of serials, books that are published one after another, like National Geographic. Turns out that like National Geographic, Volume 1, Number 1 was 1868. And in, whatever it was, they published something with Buzz Aldrin's statement, this quote. The way our metadata was currently arranged at the time, we actually found the record for the first volume, first issue. And so, obviously, we had to do some cleaning. Also, when you tend to do key term extraction, all the current algorithms for key term extraction are based on statistical measures that don't assume that you're taking quotes and shoving them through a key term extractor. And so we basically have a lot of things that don't quite look like key terms, like John F. instead of John F. Kennedy. So I just want to end with a little observation that you have these labels for quotes, and we sort of make a little leap and we say quotes that are popular, are ideas, quotes that are most popular, big ideas or little great ideas, you can actually take these labels and look at the connections between them. And you can type in a label, see a quote, and then see the labels that are associated with that quote in other books. And you can actually see a little network of knowledge here that exists. And what I did was I typed in, what did I type in? Hang on. Oh, Stanley Milgram is my man. The 6 degrees of separation. I guess it's possible that all ideas are only 6 degrees separated from Stanley Milgram. What happens is that you get some quotes, and those have labels, and those quotes then have labels, and those have labels. And you can actually sort of see Stanley Milgram. He was a cultural anthropologist. He collaborated with Irvin Goffman. He wrote about social cultural systems. These are sort of labels that pop up, and they start making sense if you look at this. He also wrote on the Holocaust. He's an anthropologist. Groupthink, I think he coined that term. Organizational behavior. He also wrote on feminism quite enough, and he was, one of the leaders in the field of defining ethnography. So what's interesting here is that you can take all the text in books that really have no order, no organization. We can mine for quotations, we can mine for labels, and then we can start connecting ideas and give people like an overview of what human knowledge is about. So just sort of in closing, I want to say what we're doing here is very much like a wisdom of the crowds effect. So it's like if you have a jar of jelly beans on the counter, and you ask one person how many jelly beans are in that jar, they might be wrong, vastly wrong. But if you ask 1,000 people and then you average it, generally you get pretty close. So a lot of people working independently, contributing to a result, can often have a vast impact and a big effect. And so really that's what we're doing here with these quotations is each of the authors who decided to spend a little extra effort copying some words from one book into another book, sometimes erroneously. And then another author copying some words and another author copying. They're voting with their pens that these words are important. So we have a diverse set of authors. They're decentralized. They're summarizing a large body of work into smaller pieces, and they're independent. They lived and died at different times. So I just want to leave you with some thoughts that we started with ebooks. I said, well, what about the content side of ebooks? Where is that going? What's going to happen when we take the 100 million books that were written before the web and bring them up to the iPad? I'm sure it will be exceptional. But what we're looking at is that mining quotations can really help organize the world's ebook information by providing links between books that are talking about similar things, maybe even in completely different disciplines, but similar things. And then if you start looking at quotations and then take a step up to the labels, introducing those quotations and the popularity of those quotations, we can think that there's this other thing, key ideas, great ideas, that can really help navigate and make more accessible the sum of printed knowledge. You believe that? And, the other conclusion there, these devices are insanely great. That's Steve would say. So I just want to point out that if you want to find out more about the exact details of how to take, 10, 15, 20 million books and find quotations, or how to take all of these quotations and look for the terms that describe them and build a map of knowledge, we have a couple of papers that you can read. And you can also go to books.google.com, go to the About the Book look for something that says popular passages, and you can navigate from there. So thank you. If there's any questions.
So I definitely see the value in having sort of this link between the interesting ideas. But it also seems to me that there are a lot of great ideas that aren't necessarily popular ideas. In fact, those great ideas are perhaps even